Hi, I'm Jacob Buck, Senior Technical Artist at Epic Games. Let's talk about vehicle deformations and the vehicle system developed for the Matrix Awakens. We wanted to create a dynamic and unique experience for each player. To do that, the vehicle crashes needed to be physically based and unique on each playthrough. Utilizing Control Rig and Chaos's new vehicle system, we're able to create an experience unlike any other. The goal for the initial highway shooting sequence was to have explosive crashes with vehicles flipping through the air. To add to the mayhem, when an agent's car clips or runs into a non agent vehicle, that car will also begin to crash, creating a cascade effect. These crashes were achieved by utilizing the vehicle's driving dynamics and modifying the vehicle's center of mass. The crashes end up taking on a life of their own. Prototyping a crash in a test map allows for quick iterations before plugging them into the gameplay map. Testing how the crash behaves at 70 miles per hour gives a good indication of how it will play during the chase sequence. A timeline node is used to control the steering and any modifications to the center of mass. To create a new crash where the vehicle swerves, then countersteers to the other side, it is best to see how the vehicle behaves with just steering. You will see that while the vehicle is starting to lean, it needs a little nudge for it to fully roll over. To get this to happen, the vehicle's center of mass will need to be raised. To visualize where it is, a debug view represents its location with a purple sphere. This is a helpful tool for visualizing the timing between the center of mass and the steering input. You can easily create different feeling crashes by adjusting the timing and amplitude of the steering and the center of mass. While physics is used to create the crashes, let's take a deeper look into how physics is being used to deform the cars. Around the vehicles, there are 14 physics bodies that act as sensors to the world. They are held to the root of the vehicle by a single prismatic joint. In Unreal 5, plasticity has been introduced to constraints, enabling plastic deformation. Each constraint now has a linear plasticity and angular plasticity attribute. These attributes will work with either the linear or the angular motors and reset the spring's rest length. When the constraint deforms past the specified percent, that deformation becomes permanent. Linear plasticity also gives you the option of which direction it is allowed to travel. By changing the linear plasticity type to shrink, the constraint is only allowed to shrink along the unlocked axis. Once the body has traveled the length of that joint's initial rest length, the spring can no longer be reset. This made it easy to limit the depth that a vehicle could be crushed. By simply changing the constraint's rest position, the vehicle is able to sustain more or less damage. The bumpers are pinned to the front and rear physics bodies with their linear breakable attributes set. This allows them to break free from the car when a threshold of force has been applied to them. In Unreal 5, you now have the ability to query and set constraint attributes in blueprints. This allows the user to define conditions that manipulate a constraint. The vehicle blueprint utilizes this by weakening the linear breakable attributes as the vehicle deforms. Without this, the bumper constraints would sometimes not break, causing unpleasant shapes. The vehicle blueprint also manipulates constraints when receiving weapon damage. The handgun causes scripted, progressive damage, while the machine gun weakens the constraint's linear motors on every hit. Also new in Unreal 5 is a node to disable a hierarchy of dynamic physics bodies. Set all bodies below physics disabled is used to enable the doors, side view mirrors, trunk, and hood during deformation events. This node allows you to disable a body and all of its children from simulating, but continue to update its position based off of its parent body. This saves extra bodies and constraints from being in the system until you need to activate them. The root component of the vehicle actor is the skeletal mesh driven by a physics asset. It is invisible to the player and takes the physics input from the world, resulting in skeletal animation that responds to the environment. To move the skeletal mesh that the player sees, a control rig component takes in a map of sources and targets. The bones of the root skeletal mesh are the sources, and the controls of the control rig are the targets. The mapping acts like a copy pose in animation blueprints, but you get to define the dictionary of sources and targets. The control rig component allows access to data at specific points in time during its initial setup and evaluation. The onPreinitialize event reads a data asset to build a map between the physics and deformation skeletal meshes. This enables a data-driven approach so each vehicle can map the inputs to the rig differently if needed. Since the rig was designed to accommodate different vehicle types, the same control rig was able to be used on every deformable vehicle in the city sample. To accommodate big structural differences in vehicle types, Booleans with branch nodes are used sparingly across the rig. Each actor blueprint sets its vehicle type to make small changes like trunk versus hatch door parenting, or disabling unnecessary evaluation for the rear door of the coupe. When first looking at the control rig, you will notice large yellow spherical controls. These controls are driven by the physics skeleton's bones through the control rig component. When a vehicle is struck from the front, the physics on the invisible skeleton react to the collision, bringing the map controls along for the ride. These controls are pushed in, and the rig provides the deformations. Using a live rig to drive deformations allows for physics input to drive an art-directed look when they are damaged. Early on in the development process, it was determined that the driver of the vehicle be kept safe from door intrusions and the roof collapsing. Limits are placed on the physics asset's linear plasticity attributes, as well as on the control rig itself. You can easily bypass these limits, but the rig will need modifications to be able to support more serious deformations. Using a control rig to power the deformations of the vehicle also gives a unique benefit of being able to easily record and modify vehicle deformations for cinematics. Using Take Recorder, the physics skeleton is recorded and provides driving and collision information. Since the physics skeleton is mapped via the control rig component, any animation on those bones will move the controls on the control rig. This allows a user to record themselves playing and then layer additional animation on top of the recording for a cinematic shot. Using control rig with a skeletal mesh whose hierarchy is this dense did come with some consequences. Copying input data and output transforms from the control rig's virtual machine can be slow with larger hierarchies. By default, the cost occurs every tick even if the control rig is empty. The control rig component comes with an option for lazy evaluation. If any input into the control rig has a delta smaller than specified by the lazy evaluation transform attributes, then the control rig does not incur the computation for the virtual machine I/O. To further speed up the rig, control rig introduced a heat map profiler in Unreal 5 to help identify the computation cost for different nodes in the rig. You can quickly see the main expense of the rig is happening in rig frame front and rig frame. The rig was designed to isolate sections of the vehicle so that they would be evaluated only when needed. Putting the rigging into separate functions made it easy to use post caching to save computation time when only one part of the rig is deforming. A post cache is a snapshot of the transforms of rig elements at a specific time. In the case of the vehicles, the controller's positions are compared to the previous execution. If the transforms are within the threshold specified on the get post cache delta, then the cache is recalled instead of computing that section of the rig. If the transforms are above that threshold, then the rig is evaluated and the cache updated to the latest pose. This setup is very similar to lazy evaluation explained before, except the operation is happening in the virtual machine, and it is up to the user to specify what items to cache. Using the pose cache along with lazy evaluation, the vehicle rig shaved off precious computation time. Since the control rig is only evaluated when needed, Any bones that need to be updated every tick were placed in a post-process animation blueprint. In the post-process animation blueprint, position and rotation data is copied from the physics skeleton directly to the deformation skeleton after the control rig has run. This enables the physics bones to directly drive the deformation bones without passing through the control rig. By using a post-process animation blueprint to move the doors, trunk, hood, and side view mirrors, the car's movable pieces can still react after deformation whether the rig is cached or being lazy evaluated. To support all of the vehicle types in the city sample, a data-driven approach was used. Each vehicle type has a data asset where a variety of attributes are set. This data is queried after each physics solve to see if a deformation event has reached a threshold to cause a secondary action. Each vehicle has a different size crumple zone. Utilizing the plastic deformation events, each vehicle will check the distance that a physics body has traveled to determine if it should disable the vehicle movement component indicated by flashing hazards. It is quick to tune how much damage a vehicle can sustain before it's disabled. By modifying these data assets, you can quickly change how the vehicle reacts when it runs into things. Each triggered event has an optional chance, distance, and rotation attribute to fire the event. To keep the vehicle's bounding box small, the headlight and taillight static meshes are spawned during a collision. It is easy to swap the static mesh for any object in the project. To open the door, trunk, hood, and break the side view mirrors, those settings are also specified in the data asset. To have Vehicle 5's trunk or hood pop open during a side impact, it's as easy as adding a list of physics bodies to enable when the front door is hit. Modifying the data assets, you can change how the car interacts with its surroundings. One feature that was cut for performance reasons was the spawning of geometry collections on impact. The grille geometry collection assets still exist in the city sample and are easy to turn back on. Motion blur on fast rotating objects is always a problem in Unreal because it uses linear motion blur. When we look at this effect on vehicle wheels, we get a rather unpleasant pinwheel look when the angular velocity of the wheel is high. If we turn off motion blur and look at the wheel again, we see what is called the stagecoach effect. If the angular velocity is such that a spoke of rim rotates to the position of another spoke over one frame, then the spoke appears not to move. Otherwise, the spoke appears to move forward or backwards. We fake the stagecoach effect by allowing the wheel to rotate up until a threshold angular velocity, then we attenuate its rotation with a function that periodically alternates between forward and reverse rotation. Now, the only thing we are missing is the rotation blur of the wheel. We developed a material to achieve this back on the GDC project, The Human Race. It works by placing a wheel sock mesh over the wheel with a material that renders a controllable radial blur of the actual wheel it encompasses. Finally, we ramp the radial blur amount on the wheel sock based on the angular velocity. Here, we see both the rotation attenuation and the radial blur together as the final effect. To parent the sock onto the vehicle's wheels, a simple control rig is applied to the physics skeletal mesh in an anim blueprint. This control rig allows the wheel sock to move with the wheels, but it removes the wheel's rotation. Putting everything together, the final effect gives the wheel radial motion blur that conveys the vehicle's speed. To take advantage of nanite, the cars have been carefully divided up into many components that can be swapped for their skeletal mesh counterparts during an impact. Geometry that stays as nanite has a significantly smaller footprint than its skeletal mesh counterpart. Because of that, vehicles that do not sustain a plastic deformation are allowed to swap back to nanite. Swapping the exterior of the vehicle to a deformable skeletal mesh was heavy, but other structural optimizations helped reduce the weight. From the deformable shell of the car, the exterior panels were extracted from the interior. This was done to reduce the memory footprint of the skeletal mesh from the skin cache. Being sure that all vehicles and crowd actors fit within the skin cache was critical for utilizing ray tracing and recompute tangents. Separating these two skeletal meshes had an added benefit that they could be LOD'd separately. This allowed the exterior of the car to maintain a higher fidelity at a greater distance while bringing the resolution down on the interior. This, combined with streaming LODs, helped reduce the memory footprint. Each transform component of the vehicle also had an added weight. Spawning additional components when needed helped regain some extra performance. This was most notably done when any pane of glass shatters. To complete the vehicle system, John is going to talk about the amazing VFX work that added another layer of realism to the simulation.
Hey, this is Jonathan Lindquist. I'm excited to share some of the approaches that we developed for the Matrix Awakens. We're going to be covering vehicle destruction, character dissolves, and so much more. Let's take a look at some of the behind-the-scenes footage. First and foremost, we decided to embrace the film's aesthetic. Targeting large bullet holes, dynamic scratches, and realistic vehicle-to-vehicle collisions on deformable surfaces meant that we needed to innovate. At a conceptual level, we wanted the vehicle to appear physically based. This meant that every inch of its surface needed to appropriately respond to forces from the environment. We clearly had to evaluate a simulation across the entirety of the mesh's surface to achieve our goals. Luckily, UE5's effects editor contained all of the necessary capabilities. Niagara can sample points on a mesh over time, perform custom logic, and render out textures. This made it our go-to solution for all of our simulation needs. The next challenge was to map a simulation across the vehicle's surface. As you might imagine, our vehicle blueprints are incredibly elaborate. They mostly start off as nanite meshes, and then elements are swapped out with new components as needed. Those moment-to-moment changes made it difficult for Niagara to track surfaces over time. So to avoid this, we made a single proxy mesh that contained all of the vehicle's important features. The proxy and display meshes contain an identical second UV layout. As a result, textures rendered using the proxy's second UV space were directly applicable to the final visible surface. Get triangle coordinate at UV allowed us to evenly distribute a 2D array of particles across the model surface. Given both the particle's initial grid position and mesh location, we were able to associate each point on the model with a render target pixel. We were then able to focus on rendering simulation data to textures. Here we can see the colorful blend of values that drive all of the vehicle's wear and tear. First, we'll cover the vehicle-to-vehicle collision data stored in the blue channel. The Niagara team wrote a bounding volume hierarchy data interface, or BVH for short. This can be used to quickly find the nearest particle in a neighboring system. In our case, it highlights the most probable point for a vehicle-to-vehicle collision. We then ran an intersection simulation to see if the vehicle sensors did in fact collide. The resulting information was baked into a texture for use in the material graph. This development was important as it allowed us to accurately detect collisions between two complex animated surfaces. We implemented tension mapping to add dents and scratches. Tension mapping is typically done by displaying the difference between an edge's at rest length and its current deformed length. When shorter, it's compressed, and if it's longer, it's being stretched. This information is often used to dynamically layer in visual details where it matters most. Traditionally, one would rely on a regularly tessellated mesh to provide smooth results. That wasn't possible in this case, nor was rendering out a full resolution tension map. So we went down another route. We sought a topology-agnostic methodology for sampling surface deformations. Maintaining a constant kernel size, or sample area, around each particle sensor for our use case was essential. For this reason, we developed a new approach that allowed us to precisely place sample points near our sensor particles. First, let's explore how these points were placed. We started with one of our main sensors. Then a tangent space vector was used to indicate our sample point's ideal location. As we can see, it's traced from the model surface. Next, we needed to constrain it to the mesh's surface to locate an appropriate sample point. We started off by finding intersections between our target line and the triangle's edges. If the target line hit an edge, we performed a number of actions to find the neighboring triangle. Given the new triangle, we could then reproject the vector down to the new surface. Then we continued the process for as long as was needed to find a final rest spot on the mesh's surface. Doing so 3 times allowed us to track deformations around the sensor. Interestingly, it can also be used to place water droplets on an animated surface. This constraint works in world space, so we can rotate the model and change wind parameters at runtime. I'm looking forward to seeing what the community uses this exciting new tool for in the future. As a side note, we explored the use of GPU raycasts to detect vehicle-to-world collisions. While it remains a viable strategy and an interesting area for further research, we didn't use it in the Matrix Awakens. One of the great features in Unreal Engine is it allows you to tweak material parameter collections at runtime. This allowed us to refine the material damage map integration across all 15 vehicles at once. In-world adjustments were vital to finding the right look. Next, we pursued methods for tracing against the deformed surface geometry. The existing toolset wasn't exactly suited for our unique needs, so we used this as an opportunity to develop an entirely new approach. We leveraged the Niagara sensor system once again to find those points of intersection. We actually start by casting a ray in the weapon blueprint against a large bounding box around the vehicle. Once a collision is detected, the blueprint feeds the incoming bullet trajectory into Niagara for refinement. Once within Niagara, an emitter finds intersections between the incoming bullet trajectories and each of the particle sensors. The first sensor in the bullet's path is used. This provides us with a very coarse intersection location in that only the particle sensor's pivot point is returned. We can then refine our results using the Traverse Skeletal Mesh module. By walking towards the incoming bullet trajectory, we're able to find a far more accurate point of intersection. This worked perfectly, but generated performance hiccups in the most intense scenarios. Toward the end of the project, a new for loop with continue node was added. This greatly improved our performance because it allowed us to opt into complexity where it was needed. First, we traced against spheres for each of our sensors. Whenever a collision was detected, we moved on to a slightly more involved ray disk intersection test for that specific loop. Pulled intersection locations are then used to spawn decals in a separate emitter. On glass, a translucent sprite renderer is used to draw localized cracks. When metal is hit, a mesh renderer projects a specialized material down onto opaque surfaces. The projected material is then gracefully integrated into the vehicle's shader using the material editor's debuffer nodes. When the final impact location is found, we use Niagara's blueprint callback function to spawn the desired squibs at the correct location. The effects team greatly appreciated this level of flexibility. Some of the steps that we previously covered, like finding tension map sample points, only have to happen once. So we're able to optimize our system by performing those steps on level load. On begin play, we spawn the vehicle damage preprocessor. Once per frame, the preprocessor calculates and records all of the data needed for one of our 15 vehicles. It renders out information to an atlas texture until all of the vehicles are processed. The final output is a set of textures that contain sensor location data along with tension mapping rest state information. Additionally, we only need to execute the simulation when needed. It's spawned the first time the vehicle is damaged and is paused as soon as the collision or deformation ends. Damaged vehicles impose a much greater cost than those in mint condition, so we call damaged vehicles in the distance. Once again, we needed a solution that worked for both nanite and skeletal meshes at the same time. We found that the easiest way was to hide the actor. Spawning a localized post-process volume around the vehicle, along with occluding particles, allowed us to gracefully hide the transition. We also wanted high-fidelity glass effects that exactly matched the original model's material qualities and form. This meant using actual models rather than generic sprites. In addition to the visuals, we needed to be aware of the effect's performance characteristics. At any time, thousands of glass fragments could be seen in the demo. So we decided to leverage Niagara's refined GPU particle systems pipeline to minimize the system's cost. Those decisions drove us towards a marriage of Blueprint, Niagara, and Pivot Painter 2. For those that don't know, Pivot Painter is a tool that allows one to transform groups of polygons within a static mesh as if they were their own actors. Doing so through the vertex shader allows one to efficiently manipulate a large number of objects at once. We bridged the gap between Pivot Painter 2 and Niagara for this project. Niagara can now transform mesh elements. We next had a focus on breaking the glass. I'd like to thank Side Effects for the outstanding support they provided on this project. They automated the task of fracturing glass from Maya, generating useful UVs, textures, and then they ran the new glass elements through Pivot Painter 2. This approach hugely increased our capabilities. The one downside was that it generated 50 plus files per vehicle. Luckily, we were able to leverage an editor utility widget to organize the files, apply appropriate settings, and generate new material instances as needed. In the end, one simply needed to assign a data asset to each vehicle. This is where we incorporated Pivot Painter into the mix. Each fractured glass pane is actually a single Niagara mesh. As I enable the purple bounding boxes, we can see that the particles and the glass shards move in unison. This correlation is formed by first sending the particle transforms down to the glass material via a render target. Then the associated transforms are applied to the mesh elements using a vertex shader. Developing an efficient method for testing was crucial due to the large number of assets that we had to support. This test map let us rapidly cycle through each vehicle and their glass elements quickly. We added a new method for particle collisions using latent GPU ray traces. GPU ray traces can collide against skeletal meshes, aren't view dependent, and have a number of other unique benefits. While this wasn't used in the final product, it is now exposed as an experimental option in the collision module. Here's one last effect that I'd like to share. To dissolve agents, we first constructed a screen space bounding box around the character. Then we spawned a grid of particles on that surface. The character and a duplicate mesh were then made to render to the custom depth buffer. Each had its own stencil ID. The duplicate was used to provide a screen space dissolve mask near the edges of decay. We then sampled the custom depth buffer and stencil ID masks to project particles onto the character's surface where they were needed. This approach allowed us to spawn particles on arbitrary surfaces regardless of their complexity. Finally, we layered in randomization, forces, and lightning to complete the effect. And that's it. Now I'd like to hand it off to Jack.
Hi, my name's Jack Oakman. I'm a senior technical artist at Epic Games. Today I'm going to be talking about the bridge destruction sequence that occurs towards the end of the demo. I'm going to give an overview of the approach we took to achieve this event, as well as offering a bit of insight into some of the tools and techniques that Unreal 5 offers, which you can leverage in your own simulations. As a key portion of our chase finale sequence, we wanted to create an event on an epic scale. The helicopter crashes beneath an overpass, for which we used similar techniques to the vehicle destruction pipeline outlined in Jacob's video. Once the helicopter is at rest though, the player is able to trigger that final cinematic explosion. The collapse that follows was achieved entirely using Unreal 5's Chaos Destruction system and the new suite of modelling tools. There were, of course, a number of objectives we would first have to identify before settling on a suitable approach to this event. Although the finale is effectively a cinematic sequence, we wanted to run and render the whole simulation in real time. Of course, this would be happening within a highly detailed environment, with plenty of vehicles, environmental assets, and Niagara FX systems running concurrently. The challenge then was that of performance, and since the intent was to deploy the demo on different gaming consoles as a digital download, it was critical to keep the disk footprint of this event as low as possible. As part of a cinematic, it was important that our result was deterministic too. Cameras would be framed to this event, and random debris could not be allowed to pollute the framing of shots, nor interfere with the other actors in the scene. At the same time, this event is highly dynamic, and so the cinematics team would need something that could easily be retimed should they wish to double cut the event or apply timing offsets, a common approach when filming explosions and destructive events. All of this needed to be achieved in a context where nanite is king and geometry is therefore at a premium quality. The solution that would allow us to achieve all of these aims was therefore to capture a cached simulation. What follows is an overview of how we achieved that result, all without leaving the editor. Having been populated using Unreal 5's rule processor pipeline, the bridge stands at roughly 100 meters long. Fracturing and simulating its demise in situ would certainly be impractical therefore, and so the first task was to quarantine the structure into a suitable, clean location. We achieved this by packing the bridge and surrounding assets into a level instance. Once done, this could then be read into a cleaner environment and source elements extracted, the key benefit being that should any changes occur within this source, we would easily be able to keep in step with those updates. Static meshes would then be extracted from the source and worked upon without fear of polluting the main environment. With our sources extracted, we could see the possibilities of bringing down such a structure. The bridge is an intersection of many roads, and since these clip neatly together, we could approach them as separate entities and benefit from the timings of their collapse being offset, allowing for visual variation and to allow also the simulation to breathe over a number of seconds. The bridge was therefore separated into 5 key regions. The lower deck, whose primary job was to create a gulf between the player character and the pursuing agents. Destruction here would be immediate, in order to form a kind of sinkhole, whereupon the upper decks could collapse into it. The middle, supporting structures would brace portions of the upper deck and fail in others. And lastly, the upper deck would be divided into 3 key regions, whose collapse would occur somewhat separately, allowing the event to span a period of seconds. Due to the scale of the bridge, fracturing was always going to be a high-risk area when adding to our disk footprint. Settling upon a suitable fidelity was therefore key. The emergence of Unreal 5's new modelling suite allowed us to sculpt mesh cutters, which could be authored in order to concentrate fractures into key areas, effectively creating a maximum byte radius, within which subsequent fractures could be contained. The unaffected areas would then become the kinematic anchors that hold the rest of the bridge up. Radial fractures with high variability ensured that cracks were concentrated toward the epicenter of the explosion, and clustering was used to wrangle these breaks more linearly, so that the collapse itself would better follow the original topology of the structure. Since overpasses of this nature are built from concrete bound together by a framework of interior meshing and large stretches of tension cabling, we wanted to combine the initial concussive force of the event with a sense of such a structure failing throughout and then buckling under its own weight. To achieve this, and thanks to the cached nature of our sim, we were able to throw the kitchen sink at our setup. Kinematic bodies were laid up beneath the bridge and animated to time its destruction. Fields were used to break the bridge, whereupon collisions would take over and carry the bridge down, giving a sense of an internal structure offering resistance all the time. In this example, we can see the combination at work. The field in red is the site of the explosion, and the purple field will ensure that the impact carries over into the neighbouring module. The larger fields will quickly propagate the force along the length of the road module, and after that, it's up to the underlying collision geometry to take over. Let's run the sim and see that result. There goes the field, bringing an upward force from below. The other fields are fired already and the collision geo has taken over. And there it begins to buckle, carrying the bridge down. Solver iterations were tuned to give us the look we want. Collision iterations were low enough that we get a bit of variation of debris falling through the collision geo, and push-out pairs were disabled altogether, since this would prevent collision intersections from easing the bridge apart as it buckles. We are now ready to capture a cache. Again, let's use this example to show that process. The target geo is selected and a cache collection is created. A cache manager is automatically placed in the scene. By default, this is ready to record the simulation. We play the sim. Once done, we can set the cache manager to static pose and review what we've caught. The static pose setting passes the transforms of our simulated bodies and can be played back as an animation with a minimal presence on the physics thread. It's a particularly useful solution once the cinematics and FX teams need to time their shots and explosions in sequencer. We can capture multiple caches concurrently or isolate sections to capture a new live simulation against other caches already playing in the scene. Here is the result of the combined caches, 5 in all. Now that our geometry collections are moving nicely, it's time to add a bit of visual fidelity to really sell the event. We'll be adding Niagara explosions, dust, smoke and debris later, but for now we want the geometry itself to feel more active and for the internal structure of meshes and tension cabling to show through as the bridge comes apart. Here is a prototype portion of the bridge to demonstrate the look we were going for. The primary operation was to target the materials on the internal surfaces to give a sense of layering. In this case, we laid up asphalt onto a base course of rubble and then a thick layer of concrete to match the bridge exterior. Fracture Mode's recent addition of an auto UV tool allowed each fractured interior surface to be atlased, whereupon we could bake a depth mask of each geometry collection, and this could then be sampled to accurately follow the bridge's original shape. This was especially important since the road itself is derived from spline meshes and has a subtle curvature, making box gradients too inaccurate to follow the surfaces appropriately. We also wanted to disrupt the surface of the road during the explosion to give a sense of asphalt and concrete cracking throughout. To achieve this, we again used the Auto UV tool, this time operating on the exterior and interior surfaces to create a curvature map. Within the resulting mask, we were then able to apply layered hairline cracks, which could be used to concentrate higher frequency cracking around the fractures themselves, and lower frequency cracks would then span the broader surfaces of the resulting rigid bodies of our fracture. With hairlines now applied, the result was radially masked in time with the cached simulation using Sequencer. The final authoring step was to mimic the internal network of reinforcing meshes and tension cabling. To achieve this, our approach was to leverage a set of instance geometry exemplars, which would then be gathered in line with the fractured geometry and go along for the ride. Given the scale of the bridge, it was easy to propagate and layer tens of thousands of these instances, all of which could be attached to the geometry collection via its auto embed tool. We determined, however, that though instanced through Nanite, passing so many transforms during even a cached playback was not a performance solution. We therefore used the cache simulation as our reference and embedded geometry only on the surfaces that would be visible. Nevertheless, we still have around 4,000 instances in the final version. Although comprised of only a small number of unique exemplars, the visual complexity that they offer is enough to fool the eye into believing that an internal structure is present throughout the entirety of the bridge. With our 5 cache collections ready to deploy, their material effects sequenced alongside them, and Nanite enabled throughout, the bridge was complete. It was now up to the FX team to augment the simulation with explosions, dust, and debris using Niagara. So with that in mind, let's hand it over to Matt Radford.
Hey, I'm Matt Radford, Senior Visual Effects Technical Artist at Epic Games. Now we're going to talk about effects animation, motion graphics, and dodging bullets. So enjoy. Okay, let's talk about pyrotechnics, explosions. A lot of things blew up in the Matrix Awakens, and we needed to figure out a solution that would look really cool in next gen, but also would perform in this giant city. So I'm going to show a little behind the scenes of how these effects came together, and then we'll deep dive on what we did to make them.
Watch out! Hang on. Hold steady. Hell yeah! What are you doing? Time to blow this box down.
So when we started the project, we weren't really sure what the PlayStation or Xbox was going to be able to do, but we knew we wanted to push things to the next generation. So we just started making stuff, blowing things up, seeing how it would interface with the chaos destruction system, and we did a little soul searching. We explored real-time fluid simulation in the engine, which you can see here. One of our artists, Dan Pearson, did this cool task that spins and flips over, and then there's like a bullet time fireball, and it all ran real time in the engine. It was really satisfying to play with and look at. And this feature is actually going to be in beta in 5.0, so you can play with it soon too. In the end, we decided to find a more performant approach so that we could have tons of destruction everywhere instead of maybe something super cool that was isolated in one spot. For this, we kind of went to a classic video game method, sprites. It's really just camera-facing quads that, billboarding pieces of geometry. We would render isolated images of smoke, little puffs, swirls, fire, and we would run this through a cool shader that would basically spit out really satisfying filmic images. The simulation was done with Houdini's GPU PyroSolver. This thing was really new at the time, and it was incredible. It was very real time. It ran pretty quickly in the viewports. It had great sourcing. And so actually, we rendered a lot of the images you're seeing from the viewport. And that was what drove the flipbooks. And that allowed us to iterate really, really quickly. So we could do RGB lights, multiple scattering, baked lighting. It was great. We'd compress these down into flipbooks. This is a little maybe confusing if you're coming from the film industry where you're used to having 3D volumes. But for performance in games, we'll just kind of compress it at an angle into a 2D volume. And with the camera-facing billboard, it's a pretty effective illusion. So we'd pack our data in there. And, Next Gen let us take that data to 8K, which was pretty cool and got us, I think, a little bit of that Next Gen bump. So to make these images, we used a compositing network inside of Houdini. We'd bring in stuff from the viewport or offline renders, and we transform, color correct, make sure they were always in the center of the frame, and then use the mosaic node to turn them into a flipbook. It was just great being able to do all of this in one location. So for the shading, we wrote a Pyro shader in Unreal that we wanted to make sure everyone using Unreal could access and didn't do anything too crazy, no custom lighting models. We simply took soft kind of ambient occlusion lighting like a dome light, and then we would plug that into the diffuse, and then we would take the fire, the temperature, and multiply it by an HDR color and put this into emissive. It just worked. Lumen handles transparency really well, and we were able to just drop these things around the levels, and they look nice and integrated. So here's the bridge shot at the end, and a look at some of the elements that went into it using the Pyro shader. So Florent Andorra did this, and I think it was just a really cool moment where people coming from games and film are all able to use the same tools and techniques to put pretty images on the screen. I think Unreal Engine 5 really enables this. Okay, let's talk about weapons. We really wanted you to feel powerful, like you could rip apart the cars and the road. And so we tried to create effects that were realistic and cinematic. And I'm going to show a reel of kind of how that came together, and then we'll talk about how we did the art and the system.
Still on us! Up ahead. It's supposed to be safer! Watch out! Hang on.
Okay, so we wanted to go for that realistic look, and the best way to do that sometimes is mixing media. So if you can show someone something fake mixed with something real, they'll probably just suspend their disbelief and think it looks cool. To do this, we used some footage from Action VFX of little spark bursts and spark hits and a few dust puffs to really give us the realistic element mixed with CG stuff from Houdini and Niagara. So we take these grayscale flipbooks and we'd run it through a lookup table to color them realistically and put it on a shader. Here you can see me just like tearing up the road, shooting at stuff, way more than what actually happened in the game, but it was pretty satisfying, and these were the shipping effects that we went with. Okay, so let's talk about the system itself, because it's also pretty cool. It's just made with Blueprint and data assets. There was no C++ involved. So we didn't know how many weapons there were going to be in the game at first. So we kind of wanted to keep it open where you could change the model, swap weapons, add new ones. We did this a lot for NPCs when they would come online, and we'd really want them to suddenly have a submachine gun, and it was really easy to add. Now, these data assets could contain tons of stuff, including other data assets. And so we could tweak the system, change the fire rate, where the shells came from, how the muzzle flash looked, what squibs would play when a certain gun shot something else. And we could do this all while the game was running. That was, I think, the coolest part. So if you were changing this stuff and tweaking while you're driving down the highway getting shot at, you'd stop and it would still be there. That made it all worth it. So for the impacts themselves, this was kind of the cue that you should shoot at these cars. So it was really important that anytime someone fired at you, you saw the result on the screen where you were looking. We put a lot of strategy into making sure this felt nice and held up under all the circumstances. What we would do is anytime someone shot at you, we would play a muzzle flash and the shells and a tracer, and it was all coming out at the gun, aiming kind of at you. But we would actually just look through the camera, step out a ways, and then shoot a ray back at us in a cone. And this let us, with the combination of the data assets, really just tweak how getting shot at felt in the game. It was really satisfying and super cinematic. Okay, let's talk about tech art. So sometimes it's hard to know what tech art is, but for us, really, it was just bringing the frame to life with tons of cool little details and adding all these visual references to the movies that we could.
With shots.
A great example of these bullet wakes done by Asher Zhu and Ryan Brooks. This refraction shader just really held up under any angle. It kind of just sampled the scene color, blurred it, tinted it green, and aberrated the colors a little bit as it marched through. The text rain was a tough effect, because we had to use it to transition between the construct and the game world, and also to transform between characters. So it had to hold up under a bunch of different circumstances. You can see it worked on buildings, or Keanu Reeves, or Carrie-Anne Moss, or a bunch of metahumans in a crowd. Pretty cool shader. And the text rain also had kind of this close-up treatment. And one thing I wanted to point out that Asher Zhu did on this I'd just never seen before is making a custom convolution kernel to get this vertical streak. It worked, and I'd never seen that done before. It was really cool. So in the back of the car, the windshield gets shot out, and there's all this glass that kind of just sways back and forth as the car turns left and right. And it was really satisfying, added this great scale cue to feel like there was tons of detail. And I just never got old watching it throughout all the sequences. This was done by Jimmy Gass, and I think was really successful. Ultimately, we took this cool fractured mesh that we had, brought it into Houdini, made points out of it, brought those points back into Niagara, simulated them with a position-based dynamic solver, and then used the results to just transform the original mesh with world position offset. This let us really art direct it, make sure the fractures look just how we wanted, and then have it roll around the back seat. The agent dodge was a super cool effect that we were really worried at first. How are we going to do this? We almost didn't do it. But Asher solved this great problem of being able to reproduce meshes really quickly by drawing one particle per triangle and just sampling the G buffer at their original location. It created this incredibly successful, blurring, streaked version of a character. And I think sometimes it looks just as good, if not better than the movies. Let's talk about motion graphics. This was a really important part of the gameplay and something that, we needed to get right. And it's subtle, but you needed to know where you could shoot, what was available as a target. And so it was important to really do this justice. Here, let's take a look at some of the motion graphics and how they came together, and you'll see how much we changed them over the course of development.
You drive. I'll shoot. It's supposed to be safer. These guys just don't give up. You again.
So we knew we were going to have a ton of these targets, and we really wanted placing them to feel flexible and easy. So we wanted to make a great 3D in-world UI system. We did that with Niagara and a little bit of a custom engine change. Now you can see here, I'm able to just move these transforms around, attach them to objects, do whatever, and they always stay the same size and play cool animations. These animations were authored in Niagara, and for overlapping elements, it's really just spawning a bunch of different sprites and having them animate or loop forever or use a color curve to make it glow. And it really was easy to use, and I think Niagara was a great fit. It also let us solve this all on the GPU, so we could render an infinite amount of these small cursors and not affect performance at all. The big problem, though, was they were transparent objects, so they would get motion blurred along with the rest of the scene. This just didn't feel like a user interface element. So we made some changes to the way that transparency is drawn in the engine. Now, if you just go down to the translucency pass and swap it, you'll have a little drop down, and you can just choose after motion blur, and that'll render your thing perfectly crisp, alias free. It's really cool, and I can't wait to see what people do with this engine feature. The last thing is, anything worth doing is worth doing with others. We had an awesome team on this, and it took the brainpower of all of these brilliant people to pull this off. So we're really excited, and we hope you enjoy The Matrix Awakens.